On Saturday nights, there are a few seconds that always feel exactly the same. The lights come up. The audience starts cheering. Michael Che and I walk out together, smiling like we totally know what we're doing. Sometimes we actually do. Sometimes we're just hoping the teleprompter remembers more than we do. The thing about sitting behind the Weekend Update desk is that people think we're just reading jokes. That's the easy part. What they don't see is the strange balancing act happening underneath every punchline. Every week, the news somehow becomes even more unbelievable, and our job is to look at it, shrug, and ask, well, how do we make that funny? Lately, though, the headlines have been doing most of the work. Che looked over at me as the applause finally settled. I could already tell from the grin on his face that he had something mean waiting for me. He usually does. That's our friendship. We spend the week writing jokes for America and writing slightly worse ones for each other. The cameras rolled, the music faded, and just like that, another week of American history became another episode of comedy. One of the first stories centered on President Donald Trump. According to a senior official, Trump reportedly keeps a letter inside the Resolute desk addressed to Vice President J.D. Vance in case he dies or is assassinated. Now, it's already one of those stories that sounds like it skipped the journalism phase and went straight to satire. A secret letter hidden inside the president's desk addressed to the vice president. Your brain immediately starts imagining something dramatic, a heartfelt farewell, instructions for preserving democracy, maybe even the Wi-Fi password. Instead, the joke practically wrote itself. I wish it had been you. That was it. Short, cold, perfectly ridiculous. Weekend Update has always thrived on moments where reality arrives looking suspiciously like parody. This felt like one of them. J.D. Vance wasn't done making headlines. He criticized protesters confronting ICE officers, suggesting people should express themselves by writing opinion pieces or arguing online instead. Which, in theory, sounds wonderfully civilized. Shea couldn't resist comparing that advice to another famous group of people who apparently believed political disagreements should be expressed creatively. You know, he said, just like these young scholars did on January 6th. That's the rhythm of Update. Take an official statement, turn it just a few degrees. Suddenly the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Then Shea took a sharper turn. He acknowledged that ICE agents are people. They have jobs, but he imagined one of those quiet moments every human being supposedly has during the workday. That tiny pause where you ask yourself whether you're making good life choices. Only in this version, the question became, are we dicks? The audience laughed, not because the subject itself was funny, because comedy often lives inside uncomfortable honesty. Sometimes a joke isn't trying to solve anything. It's just pointing a flashlight somewhere people already keep looking. Meanwhile, King Charles made news by visiting the United States during celebrations surrounding America's 250th anniversary of independence from Britain. History has an odd sense of humor. 250 years after losing the colonies, the king comes back. It almost feels like someone forgetting a jacket at an ex's apartment. Joke imagined Charles showing up partly to request the release of a British hostage supposedly being held by an American terrorist. International diplomacy filtered through Weekend Update logic. Trump, meanwhile, released plans for what his future presidential library might look like, not simply a library, a massive golden skyscraper with a golden escalator and a giant golden statue of himself. At some point, you stop asking whether something sounds realistic and start asking whether gold can legally qualify as a personality trait. I couldn't resist comparing the vision to something straight out of the book of Revelation, because it actually belonged there, because it somehow looked like it thought it did. Then came one of those headlines that feels completely ordinary until you remember who's involved. President Trump attended opening night of Chicago at the Kennedy Center. Honestly, I like presidents going to the theater. Culture, Arts Broadway, wonderful. And my brain immediately wandered toward perhaps the single most famous presidential theater visit in American history. I didn't even need to finish the joke. The audience already knew exactly where it was headed. Sometimes the silence before a punchline is funnier than the punchline itself. Next came Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He'd recently undergone rotator cuff surgery. The photo accompanying the story wasn't exactly flattering. He looked sunburned, very sunburned. Jay described him as looking like he just returned from a mission to the sun. Again, not subtle, not accurate, just funny. Then came my favorite twist, Tylenol, personified, being down at RFK Jr. like an old rival finally admitting defeat.
Well, 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 look who needs me now.
Those tiny imagined conversations between public figures and inanimate objects somehow never stopped making me laugh. Another headline involved the man accused in an assassination attempt against a television correspondent. Investigators reportedly found a selfie taken shortly before the incident. The caption read something close to, "Felt cute, might delete president." It's horrifying, absurd, and somehow perfectly captures the internet's ability to reduce literally everything into social media language. Reality has started speaking fluent meme. King Charles returned to the news again, this time after meeting Zohran Mamdani. Shay joked that the king should simply take him back to England because he was an Indian treasure. That's one of those jokes that depends entirely on timing. Half the room laughs immediately. The other half needs exactly 2 seconds before catching up. Those are some of my favorite laughs. You can actually hear the realization happening. Then came one of the strangest headlines of the week. A FEMA official claimed he had somehow mysteriously teleported into a Waffle House 50 miles away. Now, maybe, or stay with me here, maybe you drove there, drunk. The supernatural explanation somehow seemed less believable than the obvious one. Melania Trump also entered the news cycle. She publicly denied reports suggesting Jeffrey Epstein had introduced her to Donald Trump. The denial itself became less memorable than the joke that followed. According to Che, they actually met after Trump cracked open her shipping container. That line landed with exactly the kind of Gasplaw Weekend update secretly loves. Half laughter. Half. Did he really just say that? Yes, he did. Then came Space Artemis 2. Astronauts returning safely after a mission, even in stories celebrating extraordinary scientific achievement. Update somehow finds the weird angle. Joke imagined the entire mission taking place around a Hollywood soundstage, not because anyone believed that, because conspiracy theories have become so common that almost every major event now arrives with its own alternate reality already waiting online. Of course, Trump returned almost immediately. He'd spent considerable time talking about Greenland. If you only followed headlines casually, you could be forgiven for thinking Greenland was less a territory and more someone who had ghosted him on a dating app. That's exactly how I imagined it. Trump enthusiastically messaging Greenland, complimenting it, offering enormous amounts of money. Greenland politely declining. The conversation spiraling into the kind of rejection meltdown usually reserved for screenshots shared in group chats. It's amazing how quickly geopolitics can start sounding like bad online dating. Another announcement revealed Trump planned to attend the White House Correspondents' Dinner. The event would be hosted by mentalist Oz Perlman. People were impressed. Mind reading, psychological illusion, amazing. I shrugged. I didn't need supernatural powers. I claimed I could read Trump's mind myself. Word. Dementia. The audience reacted exactly as expected. Some laughed immediately. Some hesitated. Some looked at each other first. Comedy has become one of the few places where people process uncomfortable conversations together. Then came news that the Justice Department had formed a task force focused on addressing anti-Christian bias. That's serious policy. Shea immediately compared it against one of the darkest scandals in church history. Brutal, absolutely brutal. Weekend Update has never been interested in pulling punches equally. If something deserves criticism, it's fair game. It's part of the job. King Charles appeared one more time. He reportedly presented Trump with the original bell from a British submarine. If you ever need us, the king supposedly joked, just give us a ring. Simple, elegant. Diplomatic. Our version went somewhere else. Trump, we imagined, already had Britain saved in his phone under the contact name Andrew Island. That's the sort of joke that makes exactly the right number of people grown. Back in orbit, astronaut Victor Glover sent a remarkably warm message to Earth.
You look amazing. You look beautiful.
A genuinely touching sentiment. Shea looked at the quote and somehow heard something entirely different. According to him, only the black astronaut could manage to catcall an entire planet. The audience exploded. It's ridiculous. Completely ridiculous. And that's often exactly where the biggest laughs live. Then came photographs of the dark side of the moon, rare images, historic scientific, apparently revealing a rat tail. No explanation, none needed. Sometimes nonsense wins. By the time we reached the next headline, the rhythm of the show had fully settled in. Politics, space, royalty, government. Back to Trump, back to another unbelievable week in America. And somehow we were only getting started. By this point in the show, the audience had settled into that familiar weekend update rhythm. A politician says something, a government agency releases a statement, somebody announces a new initiative. And somewhere between the headline and the punchline, reality takes a wrong turn. That's where we usually meet it. The next story was about the Supreme Court. Legal experts were saying a recent ruling had taken what they described as a wrecking ball to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It's not exactly the kind of sentence that naturally gets applause during a comedy show. It's heavy, it's serious, it's the sort of news people spend weeks debating. So instead of pretending it wasn't uncomfortable, we leaned into the discomfort. The joke wasn't really about the court, it was about history. We said that if you asked black Americans, it probably felt less like a wrecking ball and more like a fire hose. One sentence. A reminder that sometimes history doesn't disappear. It just changes costumes. The audience laughed, but it was one of those laughs that carried a little weight behind it. Then it was back to space. President Trump had met with the Artemis II astronauts in the Oval Office. According to the story, he told them something wonderfully uncomplicated. I like space. Honestly, I believed it. It sounded exactly like something someone might say when they realize astronauts are standing in front of them and they need to contribute to the conversation. There's a certain purity in a sentence that's simple. Of course, I couldn't leave it there. I said it was also a direct quote from Melania Trump's wedding vows. That joke got one of those delayed laughs where people first picture the wedding, then they picture that being the entire ceremony, and they lose it. J.D. Vance was back in the news again. This time he had written a book about converting to Catholicism. Books are supposed to help your public image, usually. So naturally, the joke became that the Catholic Church considered it somehow the worst publicity we've ever had. It's fascinating how often politics and religion intersect in headlines these days. It's even more fascinating how often they intersect inside jokes. Congress had managed to avoid another government shutdown. Funding for SNAP would continue through the following September. That's genuinely good news for a lot of people. Say stared at the camera. Thank God he deadpanned. I was this close to donating food. That was classic Che. Take a socially respectable idea. Confess the opposite. Watch people laugh because they know he's kidding, or at least they hope he is. Trump attended a Washington Commanders game. Apparently, it had been a while. The joke imagined him showing up in the wrong team's gear. It wasn't really about football. It was about the image of somebody so disconnected from the event that they looked like they'd wandered into the wrong wedding reception. Sports have a funny way of becoming political theater without anybody planning it. Then came Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. Whenever his picture appeared on screen, the audience was already halfway to laughing. Not because of anything he'd said, because the setup compared him to someone who had just been cut off by a bartender. Sometimes the visual joke arrives before the written one. He testified before Congress about the cost of the conflict involving Iran. The estimate had already climbed into the billions. She asked the question everybody secretly asks whenever they hear military spending figures. What are we bombing them with? Then came the answer. White House ballrooms. That line worked because it blended two completely unrelated stories into one absurd image, a ballroom flying through the air. Military budget solved. Trump referred to the conflict as A little journey. A little journey, that's one way to describe almost anything if you're determined enough. Vacation, road trip, trip to Costco, military conflict. Apparently, they're all little journeys now. Then there was discussion about the Strait of Hormuz. Trump suggested it would reopen naturally, but if it didn't, the Marines would apparently deploy a little bit of spit. International diplomacy had somehow become playground flirting. Again, reality had wandered directly into sketch comedy. Before negotiations broke down, Trump reportedly warned Iran against making more demands. According to the joke, he insisted they had no cards, which immediately raised the obvious contradiction. They're literally holding the strait. Sometimes political language collapses under its own metaphors. All you have to do is repeat it. The headlines turn toward reproductive rights. A federal appeals court blocked the mailing of a commonly used abortion medication. It's one of those stories where everybody in the room immediately knows they're entering controversial territory. Comedy doesn't magically erase that. Instead, it changes how people process it. The joke suggested that technically any drug can become an abortion drug if you take enough of it. Dark? Absolutely. Unexpected? Also, yes, that's usually the formula. Pete A. Hegseth appeared again. Another hearing. Another quote, this time, according to the report, an airman had told him the military simply needed bigger bombs, didn't even hesitate. How about Kristi Noem's husband? It happened so quickly that the audience almost missed it before bursting into laughter. Sometimes the fastest jokes land the hardest. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. returned, this time challenging Duncan to prove sugary drinks are safe. The story itself was serious. Public health usually is. The joke wasn't. She announced that this meant one thing, a push-up contest with Ben Affleck. Only one person in the audience clapped immediately. Somehow became funnier than the punchline itself. Comedy audiences are amazing. Sometimes they're laughing at you. Sometimes they're laughing with you. Sometimes they're laughing because one confused guy started clapping at exactly the wrong time. Then came passports. The State Department planned a special edition passport featuring Donald Trump. Now imagine that. Every time you travel internationally, the first thing immigration officers see is the face of the person many travelers are trying to take a break from. The joke wrote itself. You'll always carry a reminder of why you fled the country. The audience loved that one, mostly because everyone has experienced travel stress. It's easier to laugh at politics when it's hidden inside airport anxiety. There was another image. The design made it appear as though Trump's portrait was burning a hole through the Declaration of Independence. Nobody needed Photoshop. Reality had apparently handled the visual metaphor on its own. Victor Glover's beautiful message to Earth came up again. You look amazing. You look beautiful. She repeated his observation. Only the black astronaut could manage to flirt with the entire planet. It somehow got an even bigger laugh the second time. Some jokes improve through repetition. Others improve because the audience starts anticipating them. Trump's State of the Union address made history, not because of policy. Because of length, it became the longest State of the Union address ever delivered. I compared it to lasting almost 2 full diapers. The audience groaned. Exactly the response I wanted. Good political jokes don't always get explosive laughter. Sometimes they earn synchronized groans. Those count too. During the speech, Trump declared America was back. Bigger, better, stronger than ever. Missing a beat, Shea replied, so is measles. Sometimes current events accidentally hand comedians the perfect callback. Florida supplied the next headline. A homeless man had boarded a yacht. When police questioned him, he claimed he was watching it for his friend, President Trump. He also claimed he had been mayor of New York. That became my impression of Rudy Giuliani without ever saying Rudy Giuliani. The audience filled in the blank themselves. That's one of the pleasures of live comedy. You don't always have to explain the reference. People arrive ready to connect the dots. Kristi Noem testified before Congress. 2 testers interrupted her hearing by shouting a line from The Exorcist. The power of Christ compels you. She mostly ignored them. Mostly, the joke imagined her briefly looking back just to make sure. Tiny glance became the funniest part of the mental picture. A school board in New Jersey considered renaming an elementary school after Donald Trump, Trump Elementary, even saying the words feels strange. Then came the mascot, citing allegations. One phrase, entire room laughing, sometimes brevity is undefeated. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez suggested America may already have had a gay president. We offered a playful guess. Maybe the one obsessed with ballrooms and the village people. Again, the joke wasn't trying to make a factual claim. It was pointing out a public image that people had already noticed. Comedy often lives inside exaggeration. Invention, exaggeration, then Hollywood entered the conversation. The Michael Jackson biopic had earned nearly $100 million in its opening weekend. A record huge success. Then came the turn. It still didn't crack the top 10 highest grossing weekends involving Michael Jackson. That joke landed because it forced everyone to remember a very different set of headlines. Trump hosted another series of events at the Kennedy Center. Sylvester Stallone, Gloria Gaynor kissed the village people. Eventually, I found myself asking the question nobody expected. Was Donald Trump secretly living as a gay man from 1978? The image was absurd, which was exactly why it worked. Trump also claimed that a BBC documentary had altered footage of his January 6th speech using artificial intelligence. The accusation itself sounded extraordinary, so we imagined the fake version instead of hearing his original words. The speech suddenly transformed into one of those ridiculous internet advertisements. We fight like hell for horny MILFs in your area. Sometimes AI jokes aren't about artificial intelligence. They're about how every corner of the internet eventually starts looking exactly the same, then another headline. A rash had reportedly appeared on Trump's neck. Medical issue? Laundry accident? Weekend update shows option 3. Apparently somebody washed his shirt in holy water. That's the sort of joke that depends entirely on one visual image. You either picture it or you don't. The audience clearly did. Amazon announced plans to donate $1 million toward Trump's inauguration. For generosity, political strategy, Che had a simpler explanation. Amazon and Trump both wanted to ship things out of the country as quickly as possible. It was a business joke disguised as an immigration joke disguised as a logistics joke. Sometimes 3 layers are better than 1. By then, I glanced over at Michael. He looked exactly the way he usually does after delivering a string of especially brutal punchlines. Perfectly calm, like someone reading today's weather. Meanwhile, I was sitting there wondering, news had once again managed to outpace satire. Every week we promise ourselves reality can't possibly get stranger. Every week reality hears that challenge and accepts it. As the show moved toward its final stretch, one idea kept surfacing over and over again. It wasn't about one politician. It wasn't about one policy. It wasn't even about one news cycle. It was about image. More specifically, it was about the enormous difference between the image people carefully build for themselves and the one that eventually develops on its own through years of public appearances. Donald Trump has spent years describing himself with remarkable confidence. Among the many phrases that have become associated with him, perhaps none has lasted longer than a very stable genius. It is a description he has repeated in interviews, speeches, campaign events, and social media posts. Whenever critics questioned his intelligence, memory, judgment, or decision-making, he responded the same with complete certainty that he possessed exceptional intellectual ability. He frequently pointed to his education as evidence. He reminded audiences that he attended the Wharton School. Sometimes he simply mentioned the school. Other times he described himself as an outstanding student. On still other occasions, he recalled hearing that he had finished first in his class, adding that when you hear something like that, sometimes you simply let people keep saying it, whether discussing business, politics, economics, or foreign affairs. The underlying message remained remarkably consistent. Trust me. I'm smart, actually. I'm smarter than almost everyone else. By itself, there is nothing especially unusual about politicians speaking confidently. Confidence is practically part of the job description. Campaigns reward certainty, television rewards certainty, social media practically demands it. But there is an interesting side effect. The more confidently someone presents themselves as the smartest person in every room, the more closely people begin watching for moments that might challenge that image. Eventually, every public appearance becomes a test. Every interview becomes another opportunity for comparison. Every off-the-cuff remark gets replayed, not because people suddenly care about small mistakes, because expectations have become enormous. That contrast became the focus of a segment on The Daily Show, where host Desi Lidich looked at Trump's long-running claims about his intelligence through the lens of one particular video clip. The clip itself wasn't especially dramatic. There was no heated confrontation, no shouting. The scandal, Trump was describing a cognitive assessment, a basic mental screening used by doctors. As he explained one of the opening exercises, he said participants were asked to remember 4 animals, simple enough: lion, giraffe, bear, shark. Almost everyone watching assumed the demonstration would last only a few seconds. Instead, something unexpected happened. As Trump repeated the sequence, the list began changing. One attempt included a lion, bear, an alligator, and a squirrel. Another version became lion, giraffe, whale, and shark. Then he paused, started over, tried again. Only on a later attempt did the original sequence finally return in its original order: lion, giraffe, bear, shark. The moment itself wasn't earth-shattering. Anyone can misspeak. Anyone can lose their train of thought. Anyone can accidentally substitute one word for another while speaking on camera. It wasn't really what drew attention. The discussion centered on something larger: the contrast. For years, Trump had presented himself as possessing extraordinary mental sharpness. Now, viewers were watching a clip in which even a very simple example became surprisingly difficult to repeat consistently. Desi Lidich's approach wasn't to diagnose anyone. She didn't attempt to explain the mistake. Instead, she simply placed Trump's own words beside his own performance. The audience was invited to notice the difference for themselves. That made the comedy more effective. Rather than telling viewers what to think, the segment simply highlighted 2 moments that appeared difficult to reconcile. On one screen, a politician confidently describing himself as exceptionally intelligent. On another, the same politician repeatedly changing a list of 4 animals while trying to explain a cognitive exercise. Comedy often works best when it resists the urge to over-explain. Sometimes all it has to do is hold 2 pictures side by side. The audience fills in everything else. After the clip circulated, Trump responded on Truth Social. He criticized Desi Lidich personally, describing her as low-rated, nasty, and fake news. He insisted his memory remained excellent. His mind, he said, was in perfect condition. He also argued that the video had been shown without sufficient context. Public figures defending themselves is hardly unusual. In many cases, the response ends the conversation. This time, however, it had almost the opposite effect. The following evening, Lidich answered with another joke. He remarked that if explaining someone's genius requires more editing than the original clip itself, that might reveal part of the problem. The audience responded enthusiastically, not because the joke proved anything, because it redirected attention back toward the original video. Ironically, the defense encouraged even more people to watch the clip again and then again. Sometimes responding to criticism causes it to fade away. Other times it introduces the criticism to people who hadn't seen it before. That is one of the strange realities of modern media. Every rebuttal becomes another advertisement. Every denial becomes another headline. Every attempt to change the subject sometimes strengthens the subject instead. Throughout the week, another late-night program reflected on something slightly different. Instead of focusing entirely on intelligence, discussion turned toward public perception. For years, commentators have tried to explain Trump's political appeal through every possible theory. Some have described him as authoritarian. Others have focused on personality. Others have debated ideology. But one observation stood out. Perhaps the bigger story isn't simply Donald Trump himself. Perhaps the larger story is what millions of Americans continue to see in him. That idea lingered. It suggested that political figures often become reflections of the people supporting or opposing them, whether viewers agreed or disagreed. It was an observation that encouraged self-reflection rather than easy answers. The program's host admitted feeling exhausted by the news. The humor remained, but so did the fatigue. There was a candid acknowledgement that trying to process nonstop political drama week after week can become emotionally draining. Seeking encouragement, the host turned to the rest of the correspondents, hoping someone might offer an inspiring perspective. Instead came awkward honesty. One admitted feeling overwhelmed. Another admitted having nothing encouraging to say. Someone else confessed they hadn't even voted. One correspondent accidentally offered a speech from the movie Independence Day instead of original words. They tried comparing political uncertainty to discovering a medical diagnosis, reasoning that at least knowing the truth provides some clarity. The exchange became funny precisely because nobody succeeded in delivering the uplifting speech everyone expected. It felt surprisingly human. Sometimes people don't have the perfect words. Sometimes humor itself becomes the closest thing available to comfort. That may be one of the quiet strengths of late-night comedy. People often assume the goal is simply laughter, but laughter isn't always the destination. Sometimes it's the vehicle. It gives audiences permission to spend a few minutes confronting subjects that otherwise feel overwhelming. Politics, war, public health, the economy, international conflict, celebrity scandals, government investigations, royal visits, space exploration, constitutional questions. Somehow, all of them can exist within the same half-hour broadcast. Not because comedy makes those issues less important, because humor gives people another way to approach them. Looking back over everything discussed, one pattern became impossible to ignore. Every major story revolved around contrast. Public statements versus public perception, promises versus outcomes, confidence versus uncertainty, dodge versus reality. Whether the topic involved presidential speeches, cognitive assessments, international diplomacy, or astronauts complimenting Earth from orbit, its underlying structure remained remarkably similar. Someone made a bold claim, reality complicated it. Comedians noticed the gap, then audiences laughed. Not necessarily because the situations were funny, because the contradictions were impossible to miss. That may be the real purpose of programs like these. Not to provide final answers, not to settle political debates, not even to persuade viewers. Instead, they invite audiences to pause, observe, and recognize the absurdity that often hides in plain sight. Sometimes that absurdity comes from politicians, sometimes from government agencies, sometimes from celebrities, sometimes from ordinary human nature itself, and every once in a while, the biggest joke isn't the punchline at all. It's the headline that appeared before anyone in the writer's room touched it. As another remarkable week of news came to a close, one thing seemed certain. The next week would almost certainly bring another collection of unbelievable headlines. Another round of bold declarations. Another series of explanations, denials, celebrations, and controversies. And somewhere in another writer's room, a group of exhausted comedians would once again stare at those headlines, look at each other, and ask the same question they always do. How are we supposed to make this funnier than it already is? Because in modern America, that's become the strangest part of the job. The jokes are hard. The news makes them look easy.